Thanks everyone for having me. Thanks Brent for inviting me. As Brent mentioned, my name is Retta Bruegger and I'm based in Grand Junction, Colorado. I'm the Western Region Rangeland Extension Specialist for Western Colorado, working for CSU Extension. So I don't often come out east, but I'm happy today to take a little bit of a mental vacation and go eastwards to think more about the shortgrass prairie. And I'll be talking today about not only what does the long-term forecast look like for drought conditions in the state, but I'll also be talking about applying these forecasts using some recent research that was conducted near Nunn, Colorado at the Central Plains Experimental Range, which they did some really interesting recent research that I think gives a lot of guidance on how and how not to apply long-term forecasts in decision-making, or for you all, maybe how you might apply them. So with that, you all are probably familiar with variability, right? So these are data and photos, again, from the Central Plains Experimental Range, which has been in existence since the Dust Bowl. And they have really good data on rangeland production and also livestock weight gain, which I'll be talking more about later. But you can see here, this is kind of the central drought issue, right? So 2002, the rangeland there produced about 200 pounds per acre. The very next year that increased sixfold to 1,300 pounds per acre. And then the next year it halved down to 750 about per acre, and then nearly doubled in 2005. So in that 4-year span, there's tremendous volatility. And that's just the way it is, probably with dryland farming and also, of course, with rangeland management. But wouldn't it be nice if we could know a little bit beforehand what kind of scenario we're facing? Are we facing, as we look out to the growing season, are we facing a 2003? Are we facing a 2002? What's going to happen? And wouldn't it be nice to know as early as possible, right? And not be there in July with no forage. But historically, using forecasts can be challenging. We have low resolution in some areas, like we have low skill. There's a poor relationship between what is forecasted and what actually happens. So it can be tricky to apply these forecasts in a way that's reasonable and defensible. So I'll talk more about that in a second, but I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about where we are now. And unfortunately, you all probably know this, right? We're not looking that great. I have 2 pieces of information here on this slide, and it's just to say these are things that I'm watching, and you may be watching some other things as well. But when I think back, 2 pieces of information. One is where are we now, and then what's the outlook. So the where are we now piece, that's easy and depressing to assess, right? We are pretty dry. On the western slope here since the end of 2019, or the late summer, fall of 2019, it's been pretty consistently dry, although we had an average winter last year. We had really dry soils going into the winter of 2019, which affected the runoff, and it also affected the grass regrowth at some elevations. So you can see here, these are grasses outside of Grand Junction. Unfortunately, I think some of them are dying due to the drought. So we are in some severe conditions over here, and you all are as well. And you don't need me to tell you that, right? But then looking forward to what the seasonal outlook is, this is a product called the U.S. Seasonal Drought Outlook. It's released on a monthly basis, and they forecast for 3 months. So this is a tool I use. It doesn't speak to, timing of precipitation relative to production, but I think it's a good tool and maybe a simple tool to try to understand where we're headed. This product integrates both temperature and precipitation forecasts. Now, in our part of the world, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot more skill in terms of our ability to forecast winter conditions compared to summer conditions. So our summer forecasts are not that much better. And I think Noah would agree with me. I'm not trying to be offensive, but our summer forecast, we just don't have a high relationship between what the forecast is and then what actually happens. But we're much more reliable in terms of our winter forecasting. So this, of course, is going through spring. This forecast right now, it goes through April 30th. And after April 30th, because of that forecasting issue that we have, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. But at least to me, as I look out over the next couple of months, it looks like it's going to stay pretty consistently dry, even though Western Colorado, we are projected to have some snow this month, which would be excellent. I don't know if it's going to really dig us out of the hole that we're in, especially considering how dry past conditions are. So that's depressing, but I think it brings us back to this question of, drought is bad. We all know that, but how can we get a little more complex in terms of how we're responding to it? We already know the bad news, but what can you actually do? So this brings me to something that I wanted to talk about a bit tonight, which is that long-term study and data I mentioned in the beginning. I mentioned the USDA ARS, which is based in Cheyenne, Wyoming, as well as in Fort Collins. And then they have a research ranch that is outside of Nunn called the Central Plains Experimental Range. Perhaps some of you are familiar with it. But as I mentioned, it was founded after the Dust Bowl. And since 1940, they've been collecting livestock production information of different stocking rates on the range. So these are pictures from the 1950s of some of their cattle density treatments. So they have 3 different treatments that they've been implementing again since 1940, and they have a heavy stocking treatment, they have moderate stocking, and a light stocking treatment. And since these past 78 years, they've been measuring livestock weight gain during the summer months, given these different stocking densities. And more recently, because now we have this amazing data set, which PS, I'm really glad that I was not in charge of measuring cattle weight gain for the past 70 years. That sounds a little bit tedious, but now thanks to those researchers, we do have this amazing data set. And what they were able to do more recently is to correlate that information on livestock weight gain to larger climatic forcing trends that we know influence our climate in North America. So those 2 things, you've probably heard of these things, but they are what we call ENSO, which is El Nino, La Nina. The El Nino Southern Oscillation is the spelled out words for the acronym ENSO, and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Now, both of these phenomena are related to sea surface temperature in the Pacific. The La Nina and El Nino are associated with sea surface temperature in the equatorial region of the Pacific, and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is associated with temperatures in the Pacific off the West Coast. So that's not necessarily that important. It's kind of fun, but I guess some significant differences between these 2 climate forcing trends is that ENSO switches on 1 to 3 year timescales. So, for example, right now we're in La Nina, that is projected to switch later this spring, I believe, to a neutral phase. Whereas the Pacific Decadal Oscillation has really long cycles. It switches every 10 to 30 years. So they can be pretty it can last a pretty long time if you're in a particular Pacific Decadal Oscillation cycle. So going back to our original question, that the researchers asked. So they looked at, can we use our knowledge over the past 70 years of these 2 cycles that influence our climate in North America to predict the livestock weight gain that data that they had collected over those 78 years. Which, if they could, right, if these 2 cycles help predict livestock weight gain, that would give us some early warning about what the forage might be on rangelands in eastern Colorado. Because both the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and what El Nino La Nina cycle we're in, that's information that you can have throughout the winter, and you can have it in April and springtime. So you can make a stocking decision before you get into the growing season, or perhaps maybe not make a decision, but that information can inform your decision instead of waiting until the end. So short answer is yes. The researchers found that the long-term forecast explained about 70% of the weight gain over the 78-year experiment. Of course, that leaves 30% of the weight gain that was not explained, right, by these 2 phenomenon. But that tells us a bit about the predictive power and how we could maybe use El Nino, La Nina, and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation in decision making. So short answer, yes. Long answer, Still a little bit confusing. So one of the things they put together was this decision tree that you see here on my screen. And I think this is helpful just because I do find it challenging to keep all this, broad scale climate data in my head, right? So they put together this decision tree. You start up here. I know that they look at this in January or throughout the winter and determining which Pacific Decadal Oscillation phase that you're in. Right now we're in the cold phase. And then, since we are in the cold phase, we can work our way down the decision tree. We know that we are again in La Nina phase of the ENSO. And so that leads to a recommendation on the stocking decision relative to moderate stocking densities. And again, because La Nina associated with dry conditions, the cold phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is associated with high variability, and some of the drier periods that we've experienced across the past 7 decades, they recommend decreasing, and we have a little more certainty around that decision. Conversely, if you will observe here, if we are in a neutral phase of ENSO, there's a lot less certainty about what the forage forecast might be. So they didn't find high resolution or high ability to predict if ENSO is in a neutral phase. There's low ability to predict what the forage forecast might be in their research. So in that case, they really recommend that you pay attention to the local precipitation amount and your current conditions. So I know going into 2020, the ARS, again, they manage a ranch, and there's a cattle producer from whom whose cattle run on the ranch. So they were coming into the spring of 2020, needing to make a decision. They felt that their residual on their pastures was pretty good. Their local precipitation was pretty good. We were in the cold phase, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and El Nino, La Nina was neutral last year at this time. So they, I believe, decided on an average stocking rate and to maintain a moderate stocking rate for last year. Then, of course, we got into last year and things were perhaps drier than expected, but they were able to make it through the grazing season. Now this year, I know that they are, again, looking at the phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation through the winter. They're also looking at El Nino, La Nina, and again, we're in La Nina, which is associated with drier than average conditions. So they're using that information now, and I believe that early April is an important trigger date for them, at which time they make a stocking decision for the summer. So they're looking at, again, coming into this year with low residual, pretty dry conditions, in addition to the other climatic information. So they're going to make a decision to lower the stocking rate relative to moderate. All right. So I think, you may be wondering, where can you get information on El Nino, La Nina? I mean, you may know already, because I think La Nina, El Nino are things that we talk about more commonly. But of course, you can access this website, which just has a synopsis, 1-sentence synopsis of whether we're in La Nina or El Nino. I have the URL here, which is probably not very easy to type, but I'd recommend just Googling the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center and El Nino. And I can post this link in the chat when I'm done. Information on the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is a little more tricky to find, but it is available publicly. You can go to NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This website here will take you directly to information on the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And if you're looking at this chart and you're thinking that makes my head hurt, I agree with you. But the key thing here is cold PDO is associated with these negative blue that is below the line. So we are here, at the very end, we're in a cold phase. So another way you could access this information, if again, this chart makes your head hurt, is you could talk to your extension agent, or you could reach out to the Colorado Climate Center, or you could reach out to me. But again, these are long cycles, they're 10 to 30 years. So it's not something that fluctuates a lot. Something interesting too that I learned working with these researchers is that some of the dry periods of the 80s, those were when we were in a cold Pacific Decadal oscillation phase. So some of those challenging periods can be explained in part by the phase of the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Decadal oscillation. All right, so the synopsis, right? It's been dry. It looks like it's going to stay dry. We have uncertainty about what's going to happen after April, but I think this study gives us some amount of information on what we can know from what's happened up until April. And it can inform decisions, especially in rangelands and stocking rate decisions on the Eastern Plains. And of course, this is developed using livestock and range data, but I would be curious to hear from many of you, it might be applicable to the types of decisions that you're making based on the timing of precipitation. And maybe your experiences with plantings as they relate to rangeland production. So, but again, that was not part of the study. The study only looked at livestock weight gain on range. So additional resources I rely on. There's the Western Water Assessment Dashboard. It's kind of like a one-stop shopping for climate and weather tools. I'd recommend just Googling Western Water Assessment Dashboard, but I'll put the URL into the chat. And then if you want more information on the study that I was referencing, we did produce a recent fact sheet that's just a couple pages long, and you are welcome to check that out. Again, you could Google early warning stocking rate for Eastern Colorado, or I'll post the link to it in the chat. So with that, I want to thank E.J. Rayner, who was the lead researcher who looked at the relationship of cattle weight gain to the long-term climate phenomena, and my other colleagues and friends who work at the USDA. So I was talking about this research a couple weeks ago with a rancher, and he said to me, Retta, I don't need any more reminders that it's dry. And I sort of started apologizing because it is depressing. And then he said, but this is a good reminder to act. So I hope that I haven't depressed you too much, but maybe this is just one more way of thinking about production and about the scenario that we are in that might be a useful framework for you.